Hello everyone, my name is Johannes Krupp. I'm a PhD candidate at the CISPA Helmholtz Center for Information Security in Germany, working with my advisor Rossow, and today I would like to present our work BGPeek-a-Boo, active BGP-based traceback for amplification DDoS attacks. As you probably know, in a denial of service attack, the goal of the attacker is to render some target system unusable, usually by flooding it with lots and lots of traffic. In an amplification attack, for this, the attacker will find a number of innocent UDP-based services on the internet and send them some requests. However, in doing so, he will spoof the source address of these requests to be the address of the victim. And being UDP-based, these innocent services will then send their replies to the victim as well. What makes this attack so dangerous, though, is that the attacker can carefully select some services whose responses are much larger than the initial requests, resulting in an attack bandwidth amplification. And this has led to many giga and even terabit attacks over the last few years. We can monitor these attacks using honeypot reflectors, which emulate vulnerable UDP services but include some rate limiting so they do not actually contribute to the attack. This lets us see who is being attacked and the overall numbers of attacks. What is surprisingly difficult to answer, though, is who is launching these attacks? Where do they come from? And this is actually a hard question, because if we look at such an attack from the perspective of the victim, all traffic that we receive here is coming from the amplifiers, but we have no direct contact with the attacker. And taking the perspective of an amplifier seems a little bit better initially. After all, here we have traffic from the attacker directly. Unfortunately, though, all packets here carry a spoofed source address, so we also don't get the attacker's address directly here. Does this mean that we're out of luck? Not quite, because even though all traffic here is spoofed, it still does originate from the attacker. And this is something that we can use to our advantage. To see how, though, we first need to take a step back. We all love to abstract away the internet as this cloud-shaped thing, but a more realistic representation actually looks something like this. A bunch of networks, so-called autonomous systems, with some links between them, forming a network of networks. In this example, the attacker is located in AS666 and attack traffic is forwarded by AS3 and AS2 before it eventually reaches our honeypot in AS1. Autonomous systems exchange information about which addresses they can reach through BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol. In this example, AS1, the system our honeypot is located in, would tell its neighbors that it knows a path to reach our honeypot's prefix. AS2, who then receives this advertisement, records this information in its local routing table and now knows that all traffic destined toward the honeypot should be sent to AS1. Not only that, but AS2 in turn can now tell its neighbors about a new path to the honeypot system. First via AS2 and then AS1. ASs 3 and 4 now also update their local routing tables and again advertise new paths to their neighbors. If a system receives multiple different routes, like AS666 here, it records both of them in its local table, but marks one of them as the preferred route and keeps the other for backup only. In this example, AS666 decides that it prefers the top route via AS3. So this is the resulting path that the traffic now takes. The interesting thing here is we can actually influence these routes. And we can do that through a technique called BGP poisoning. This is because BGP has a mechanism to prevent loops. Advertisements always include the full path to a destination, and autonomous systems can simply check whether they themselves are already part of this path. And this is something we can exploit. For example, initially our honeypot AS told its neighbors that it could reach the honeypot directly. However, instead it could claim that there was a path to the honeypot through AS1, then AS3 and then AS1 again. Of course, no such path actually exists, but nothing prevents us from claiming otherwise. When this advertisement reaches our neighbor AS2, it will simply update its local routing table entry with the new path. But since our honeypot system is still the first entry of the path, the next hop remains unchanged. The interesting thing now happens at AS3. Since we claimed that AS3 was already on the path, the loop detection here triggers and drops the route that AS3 had before through AS2. So we now have poisoned AS3. However, not only does AS3 lose its route to us, it also has to withdraw the route it was previously advertising to the attacker system, which now also has to remove one entry from its routing table in turn. This also means it now has to update its preferred route to now go through the bottom. Otherwise, the advertisement just propagates normally through the network. After propagation has converged, we end up with these routing table entries, and attack traffic is now taking the bottom route to our honeypot. And this allows us to learn something about the route. In total, poisoning a system can have one of three different effects on the attack traffic. As just shown, it can cause traffic to switch to alternative paths. In some cases, no route can be propagated to the attacker after poisoning, who then loses connections. And lastly, for some systems, poisoning has no influence on the attack traffic at all. Interestingly, we can observe these effects at our honeypot. If the alternative path is shorter or longer than the original one, we can observe a change in the time to live values. And if the attacker loses connection, we of course see that we now no longer receive any attack traffic. And lastly, if there's no change to the path, then of course we also see that the traffic at the honeypot does not change. The important point though is that the first two cases can only occur if the poison system was part of the original route, which is actually the underlying insight of our traceback approach. Whenever we poison a system and then see some change in the attack traffic at the honeypot, we have found an AS of the original path. With this, we can already build a naive traceback algorithm. We simply iterate over all autonomous systems, poison every system one by one, and if we observe an effect, add it to our set of candidates. This approach actually works, but it is horrendously slow. First, there are about 70,000 active autonomous systems that we need to probe. And secondly, it takes a while for BGP routes to converge, about 10 minutes. So realistically, we can only send about 6 advertisements per hour. This means that this approach would take just about 1.3 years to finish, which seems rather impractical. We can do better though by poisoning multiple systems at once. Instead of poisoning ASs one by one, we iterate over them in blocks. And whenever we see that poisoning a block has some effect, we split it into halves and test each half recursively. If we now assume that we can poison 128 systems at once, and we account for the effect that we now get some logarithmic overhead for the split and recurse steps, this brings our estimate down to only 91.1 hours or 3.8 days. This, admittedly, is not great, but at least it shows that, in principle, BGP-based traceback is feasible. We can even add another shortcut. We can stop our search if we find a so-called stub AS. These are systems which themselves do not forward traffic for other systems, which means that if a stub AS is on the path, it must be the origin. So now, the next question obviously is, can we do even better? After all, only few ASs will be forwarding attack traffic, so we are wasting a lot of time poisoning systems that we're not actually interested in. And this is the main motivation for our graph-based traceback approach. The main idea here is to build a directed graph over all autonomous systems. We take our honeypot system as the root of the graph and add an edge from one AS to another if the first one can have the second one as its next hop. We can then make use of this graph twice. First, we can partition the graph into multiple layers and only search for the next on-path system in the next layer. More importantly though, we can use it to prune large parts of the search space. For example, if attack traffic was coming from this part of the graph and we now poison AS2, we see that we now no longer receive any attack traffic. So we know that AS2 is part of the path. We can therefore focus our search on this subgraph below AS2 and prune the other part of the graph. And of course, whenever we can prune large parts of the graph, we get a dramatic speed up in our search. The only slight downside of this approach is that we require accurate AS relationship data up front so that we can build the graph. We evaluated our approach in a custom Python-based simulator. This graph here shows the number of advertisements or steps it takes each of the 3 algorithms to finish. The pure naive algorithm performs about as expected before. Stopping at stub ASs already shows some big improvement, but the graph-based algorithm performs far better than both of the naive variants. In fact, if you take the limit of 6 advertisements per hour, we find that a quarter of all runs of the graph-based algorithm finishes in less than 4 hours. The column on the right also shows in how many of the cases our algorithm is successful, so how often it manages to find the true origin. Here, both the naive algorithm versions perform roughly the same with a 61% success rate, while the graph-based algorithm performs slightly better with 68% success rate. To conclude, in this talk I have hopefully convinced you that we can use BGP poisoning to learn information about the path of attack traffic. We can use this to build a general traceback algorithm which demonstrates the feasibility of BGP-based traceback, that we can greatly improve performance of this algorithm by using relationship data, and finally, that both variants achieve a good success rate in our simulator-based evaluation. With this, thank you very much for your attention.